Good evening, everybody, and welcome to my talk tonight. I'll introduce myself. I'm Sandra Smith. I'm Head of Collection Care at the British Museum. And what I'll be speaking to you about tonight is the way we've looked after the museum during the lockdown period and what we're doing to think about opening, and we'll be opening quite soon. But a little bit that you might be interested about me in the first instance. I studied something called conservation, archaeological conservation at the Institute of Archaeology in London, and it's archaeological conservation and materials science, because in conserving and looking after and preserving objects, you need to understand the material science behind them, how they react with the environment, how they react with modern materials, and how they themselves deteriorate. So there's a lot of chemistry, a lot of biology within conservation work, which was my grounding. I came back to the British Museum, having been away for 17 years. So I started my early career at the British Museum as a conservator, and then I went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I became head of conservation for the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is a museum of art and design. Very, very different from the British Museum. And then last year in February, I came back as Head of Collections Care, which is a completely new department that's been established in the museum. And I lead a team of 150 people, which includes the conservators, which I'm very familiar with, and the collections managers who look after the collections in the stores, prepare them for exhibitions, move them around the world, and then the registrars who deal with the legal aspects of moving our collections around the world and lending them across the world as well. I understand that there's a number of you from America, from Australia, and also from Europe, as well as from the UK. So I'm going to try in my talk to talk to you about some of the things that we might be doing in your countries as well. So if I begin, what I should say is I will take questions at the end. I think it's quite complicated to pick up on two different screens in order to work out what people might be asking, but please put your questions in as you find them, as you want to ask them. And if I haven't answered them by the end of the talk, obviously I will come through and look at them, and I will try and answer as many questions as I possibly can. So to begin with the first slide. First slide. Thank you. This is, as I say, looking after the British Museum collections during lockdown and planning for reopening. But to give you a little bit of history and background to the British Museum, in case any of you do not know this museum. Next slide, please. The museum was established in 1753. It's a very early museum, and it was, unlike many museums which start off as private collections, it was a museum that was always intended to be open to the public. At that time, it contained not only archaeological collections and historical collections, but it also contained natural history, and it contained books and libraries. As the museum has grown and as the collections grew, then slowly over time, the British Museum was separated and became part of the collections, became the Natural History Museum, which some of you may be familiar with. And then the British Library opened, and the books and that kind of collection went over to the British Library. So now we have the British Museum, which has 8 million objects that basically cover every continent in the world and almost every period from 2,000 years ago to the present. We are collecting collections even now as we speak from modern artists. And in the context of COVID, we are wondering whether to do a collection in memory of COVID and what it was all about, looking at face masks that reflect some of the collections that we hold, because there's also sorts of designers using, British Museum designs on face masks now. So we may even have a COVID collection. My slides have disappeared, James. Thank you. We have 5.8 million visitors a year, so we are the biggest museum in the UK, and it really is remarkable how many people come. They come from all over the world. We're one of the highest tourist destinations, but we also have a UK audience as well. Next slide, please. So this is our oldest piece in the collection. Olduvai stone chopping tool, which is 1.8 million years old rather than 2 million years old. But it's one of the oldest pieces in our collection. And if any of you know the Leakeys, it was found by the archaeologist Louis Leakey, who is the father of Richard Leakey, that some of you may know about from the first hominids that were found in Africa. And it was found in a British Museum sponsored excavation. So this is one of our earliest pieces, but I thought it might be quite useful to show you some of the other collections that we have. Next slide, please. So we have a huge collection of Egyptian and Assyrian material. Assyrian are really quite sculptural pieces, and these belong to the Middle Eastern department, but they also have small objects like cuneiform tablets that many of you may be familiar with, these little tiny writing forms made out of clay that are punched with a little marker that gives lettering. And the Egyptian galleries are huge, and they span a number of different floors within the museum. Next slide, please. These are the Parthenon sculptures. They have a room all of their own. These belong to the Greek and Roman department and are cared for quite carefully because of the sensitivities about the Parthenon sculptures and the people in Greece that we are looking after them for, as we are looking after them for the whole world. Next slide, please. We have a department called Africa, Oceania and the Americas, and these include some of what some people call source communities, other people call them First Nation communities. They're often from different parts of the country. These are the Benin bronzes, which are absolutely beautiful objects that are available and on display in our galleries, and will be on display as soon as we open to the public. Next slide, please. We have the Easter Island figure, and in the background you can see this is part of the Welcome Gallery, and you can see a number of different objects, organic objects that are made from things like bark cloth, from wood, and painted decoration from feathers and so on. So we try and represent as far as possible all the different collections that we have available in the museum. Next slide, please. This is a view of the Portland vase. The vase on your left hand side is a Roman cameo glass, thought to be one of the finest cameo glasses in existence. It was made as a black glass, and then laid over the top was a layer of white glass, and then using cameo techniques which involve cutting away the white glass, they've created these beautiful forms on the surface. And if anybody ever knows Keats' poetry, and there's a poem called Ode to a Grecian Urn, they've got the periods wrong, but it's thought that the Portland vase is the source of that poem. And then on the right hand side we've got the Rosetta Stone, which was the first point at which it was possible to translate hieroglyphs. So this stone has got the same message written on it in demonic, in Greek and in hieroglyph, and by using those three different languages it was possible suddenly to release all the knowledge of our Egyptian material and across the world. So it's a really important piece that people come from all over the world to see. Next slide, please. These are some more of our African collection. This is the Akan drum, which is thought to be the earliest surviving drum from West Africa. So a really important piece, given the heritage and the history of people, and people can link with their past through it. We also have items such as the Aztec double-headed serpent, which comes from Mexico, and again this is made from turquoise wood and mother of pearl, and is a really exquisite piece that is on the top 10 hits of things to go and look at in the museum. I will show you some more of our collections and some things that you'll be familiar with as I go through the slides, but that might give you a taste for what we're dealing with. All sorts, all different kinds of materials, all different ranges of collections, all different periods. We also have a prints and drawing collection, which I'll show you something again later on in the slides that we're working on at the moment. So a really vast range of collections that all require different levels of care, different approaches to their care, and I'll try and take you through some of what those issues are as we go through the next part of the slides, which is all about what we did to prepare for lockdown. Next slide, please. So I'm not sure how it was in America and Australia and different countries like that, but we certainly got a strong feeling that we were due to lockdown as the same as the rest of Europe, probably about 10 days before we actually went into full lockdown. And within those 10 days, we started trying to prepare to be in a position where we would close the museum, walk away from all the collections, and this would be the first time in living memory that's been done, and therefore it was quite a responsibility for everybody involved to try and think how this could be done. The prior time when collections had been out of view was during the World War, when they were placed in tunnels in London to protect them, and again the museum was closed. So we knew we weren't in quite a war situation, so we started thinking about what our collections needed. This is a picture of the Hotun Gallery, and in the Hotun Gallery there are some very sensitive watercolours, sensitive scrolls. As you can see on the far side, the left-hand side, there's a beautiful scroll. The watercolours are susceptible to fading, and fading is irreversible. So when we have objects like this in the galleries, what we normally do is we put them on display, say for 3 months, so people can see them, and then we take them out of the galleries before they get to a point of fading. So we actually carefully watch the light levels and then decide this has been on display long enough, and we will take it off display and place another sensitive item on display instead, and keep doing that throughout the year so that everything is preserved in terms of its colour. And this means that in 3 generations time, our children's children will be able to see the beauty of the original colours the same way and to the same intensity that we did. So not knowing how long we were going to be out of the museum meant we had to make some really careful decisions about our light sensitive material. Where we have galleries such as the Hotun, where there is light coming through the windows, if you can see to the left hand side, you can just make out the window and a sort of mesh over the top. In those cases, any light sensitive material we covered with layers of thick paper so that the light couldn't get through to them, and we turned all showcase lights off. So in effect, the moment we left that museum, every gallery would be dark except for any natural light coming into it. So the only light would be for any emergency lighting to do with the security guards that would remain in the museum after we'd gone. Next slide, please. We also have collections with a different kind of challenge, and these are the ones that are environmentally sensitive. Many organic materials such as wood, these little Vindolanda tablets on the left hand side are made of wood, and these are fine. They're about the size of a postcard and they're extremely thin, but they're made of wood, and therefore if they become dry, we have a danger that instead of them being flat, they start to curl up, and that curling could damage the writing and the overall tablets themselves. And when they become very moist, then they could sort of spread and become and change in dimensions, and that might cause damage to them. So we have lots of collections where we're trying to manage the humidity in terms of avoiding dryness followed by moisture, because you get this fluctuation of sort of a movement that causes damage to the objects. The Vindolanda tablets, as I say, are very delicate, and we also have one of the earliest pieces of prehistoric art in the collection, this beautiful swimming reindeer, which is about 13,000 years old and one of the finest pieces of prehistoric art in the world. So no pressure, we need to look after that object. The Vindolanda tablets were on display in the galleries. The swimming reindeer were in stores. Now, the environment in our gallery is quite responsive to what's going on outside the building. We don't air condition the whole of our galleries. Those of you in Australia and America will know that your galleries are air conditioned because your climates are so much more extreme than ours, but we're quite temperate, so we tend to be able to look after the objects in the galleries themselves. The building looks after the object, and then if we place an object in a showcase, then it's further protected from the actual environment in the gallery itself. And often showcases have got equipment within them hidden underneath the sort of plinths of the showcase that manage that temperature and humidity. The swimming reindeer is in a store, and it's because it's in store, it means it's already placed into a box, and that box acts as a buffer from the environment anyway. And the store it's in is already air conditioned. And because it's such an important object, we have auxiliary equipment in that store so that if something fails, we can immediately bring in backup equipment. So things in storage probably tend to be in more stable environments anyway, because the rooms are small, the doors are shut, they're deeper inside the museum. So we were doing this balancing act about what do we need to think about, what do our objects on display, what risks do they potentially have, and where we thought things were at risk, such as the Vindolanda tablets, if we could not get back into the museum, we made a decision to take those off display and place them into the stores like the swimming reindeer, so that we knew they'd be safe throughout. Next slide, please. We also are aware that there can be dust, and certain of our objects which are on open display, which might have porous surfaces, we made a decision to wrap, because we might not be going in and doing any cleaning in the museum for as it's turned out, several months. We thought it might be weeks. Next slide, please. When we were closing down, we obviously have got work going on in all our different studios and workshops. If you could go back one, please. Thanks. And this is a view of our prints and drawings and paper conservation. If you could go back, I think it's automatically coming. That's it, great. But this is the paper conservation studio, and what you can see, it's gone again. If you go back. What you can see, I'll do this quickly. What you can see is a Michelangelo drawing, a cartoon. It's gone again. A cartoon. A cartoon is used as the you basically do a cartoon when you might be doing a large painting, or you might be doing a tapestry, and that cartoon gives you an indication of where you're going to put colour and things like that. So we had this beautiful Michelangelo cartoon that was in the process of being conserved, and we just literally had to make a decision. When things are in conservation, they can be in a very delicate condition. So we basically covered it. We made sure the environment was right, and we basically had to just walk away. What we knew was the object would be stable, but it was very strange just walking away from something like this that you know, everybody was so excited about before we left. Now I'll move on, because this next slide is obviously desperate to get to us. So we did all this preparation, we prepared for lockdown, and then basically we walked away from the museum. We didn't know how long we were going to be away, and therefore everything we did had to be remote from that point onwards. In every gallery, in every store, and in a number of showcases, we have small monitors that you can see on the left-hand side. One monitor, the one with the circle in the middle, is to test and monitor the light levels in a gallery. And the second one, that's the plain monitor, the one that's nearer to us, measures the temperature and humidity. These monitors then go to collect to a PC, and we're able to then remotely see what's happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all through the year. There is 15-minute monitoring information coming in from every different monitor. And these were what we basically needed to use to check what was happening to our sensitive materials. As I said earlier, my staff is 150 normally, and we left the museum, and then furlough happened, and there were 15 of us left on staff. So those 15 then divided 700 monitors, which is how many we've got across the museum site, between them. And every single day, people are checking those monitors to see if any environmental change is happening within the museum. Next slide, please. Just to show you how sensitive they are, this is a typical graph that you get from the temperature, which is in red, and the relative humidity, which is in blue. And this is the kind of thing we were looking at. Now, as you can see, almost in the middle of the centre of the slide, there's a really sharp spike upwards in the humidity, where the humidity goes up to about 80%. This was the result of a tap which started to leak in one of our conservation studios, and we were able remotely to realise that there was something happening within that conservation studio and ring up security, and they went with engineers straight away to that conservation studio and sorted it out. So the monitors are so sensitive, we could be that certain of picking up where issues were happening. Next slide, please. The Lewis chessmen are, oh, it's gone, if you can go back, that's it. The Lewis chessmen are another one of our museum treasures. They're beautiful ivory chess pieces with the most beautiful faces, with fantastic expressions on them from the Viking period. And these we decided that we were going to leave in the showcases because we felt that the environment was okay for them. But when we were looking at the monitors for this showcase, we found that the environment was fluctuating more than we expected, so going up and down more than we expected. And that made us realise that the showcase, which are normally really well sealed, the seal must not be as strong as we thought it might be. So we then produced designs that you can see below the Lewis chessmen to allow the showcase to be covered. Again, this was done, we were giving instructions to our security team and our engineers that were in there looking after fire alarms and flood alarms and basic things, so that then the showcase could be covered to try and manage that environment more. What we did find, though, of all the 700 monitors that we have in the museum, the only one that failed during lockdown was the one in the Lewis chessmen case. Now, if you look at these little creatures, these little figures, they have the most cheeky look on the faces and quite mischievous. And we almost, it became almost personal that we felt that these Lewis chessmen were so used to having attention that when they didn't get attention, they wanted attention and people to come back into the museum. So then we decided we weren't having any more of it. We weren't going to change the monitor. If we were opening the showcase, then we would put them back in store. Next slide, please. Which they weren't very happy about, but at the moment they're absolutely stable in store, and that's fine. Great. One of the things I should have said was that when we left the museum, we went into what's known as scenario 4. There's all sorts of different levels of museum opening, and scenario 4 is when the only things that are working and are being kept working is to look after the collections. So scenario 5 will mean even they weren't working, but scenario 4 we've intended and kept everything working as much as we can throughout. This also meant that we had all the water turned off in the museum, which when we get to coming back, I'll explain the problems of that, because the water was basically out for a number of months. So anyway, next slide, please. So we started off in March, and in March it was obviously cold and it was spring over here in England. And when we got to June, we were obviously getting into summer temperatures, and this is where the temperature in the museum started to affect the collections as well as the humidity. So this is a death mask of Oliver Cromwell, and it's made from wax. And we obviously don't want the wax to get to the point where it softens in any way, to lose the definition of the structures. So again, we went in to take that death mask off display, place it again in a cold store, so that then when we come back to the museum, we can think about putting it out again, provided the temperatures in the museum aren't too high. When I talked to you earlier about the fact that we have we have 5 million visitors. What that actually means is we have about 18,700 people walking through the museum at any one time. So when the museum closed, that meant that there was nobody in the museum that was breathing anymore, and that meant that the humidity dropped, so that everything went very, very dry in the museum, and then after about a week everything stabilized again. But it is remarkable, and it's something we really hadn't realized, that the people, we gear our museum and how it works around the number of people that we have in, and we had this we do a complete rethink when it was empty. Next slide, please. So another problem that we can have in museums, and it happens in all museums, is insect pests. Insects naturally want to eat anything organic, and I hope none of you have had it, but if you've got the finest cashmere scarf, the chances are, if an insect's going to eat anything, it's going to be in your cashmere scarf. And they use it as a food source, and it's usually a moth which flies and then places its larva in the wool of a cashmere, and it's the larva that actually eat the wool, the organics. And they're not they don't discriminate. The insects are really happy to come into our museums and eat our collection as well. So we have this huge pest management process, which means that we monitor continuously and we try and keep insects out as much as possible. Here's just 2 examples of the irreversible damage that insects can cause. You can see a Victorian claw necklace on the side, and that you can see all the powder around one of the claws, and that is carpet beetle larva. And then the slide on the right hand side is really shocking, in that what you're looking at is the remains of a pair of boots that were once completely covered in fur. If you imagine a fur coat, underneath the fur coat is like the skin part of the fur coat, and all that's left of these boots is therefore the skin. And this is how destructive insects can be, and how we can't afford to have insects in the museum. Next slide, please. So what we did do on a monthly basis was go into the museum. We have pest traps all over the museum. Some of them are called blunder traps, where an insect may sort of walk along and get stuck on a trap. And other ones have got pheromones in them, which actually attract the male moths to them, and they die. And we can get an idea of the insect count, the moth count in particular, within the galleries. So we were constantly going in on a monthly basis and checking the moth traps and the insect traps. And again, similar numbers to the monitors. That's 700 or more we might be looking for at any one time. And we also took staff into the museum, and you can see the lady on the right hand side is using a torch to actually look on the surface of an object on open display to see whether there's any insect larvae visible. I'm really delighted to be able to tell you that we've had no problems with insects, that our count has been low, and now we've got people back into the museum. So I think we've got there and gone beyond this point. Next slide, please. So now, looking at reopening, the museum hasn't yet announced when it's going to reopen, but the announcement will come imminently. So what we're trying to do is now gear the museum to be COVID safe for the visitor, really, really important to us, but also for our staff. And I mentioned earlier on that the water had been turned off in the museum, so it was no longer a place of work, because we need to have welfare facilities for our staff. And when water's been turned off for several months, there's fears of, if it's tanked water, things like Legionella disease and bacterial buildup. So it's taken months of the museum slowly turning taps back on and flushing systems and doing testing to make sure that we are safe for our staff to come in behind the scenes before the public come in. But we are starting to get staff in. Our first collection managers came in this week, and what they're starting to do is check the collections both within the galleries and within the stores. We don't expect to see anything will have happened to them, but we do need to go and reassure ourselves that there's nothing happened to the collections. So they will be people will be going into stores and looking round. The things in boxes, we won't unbox everything, but we can look for anything that looks like, I don't know, worst case scenario, that a shelf had fallen down or something had happened in the store and then we need to react to it. But we don't believe anything will be a problem, but we do want to check our collections. Next slide, please. And then what we need to do is start thinking about the public and reintroducing all our collections back into the gallery, those that we took out. On your left-hand side, you can see a view of the Sutton Hoo helmet. Again, another one of our treasures, which is on display in the upper floor galleries, and that will be available to the public again when they come in. And on the right hand side, this is part of our Day of the Dead collection from Mexico, really huge paper based objects which will need, again on open display, which is gently being dusted in order to make sure that the colours are vibrant for when the public come back in. Next slide, please. When we left the museum, we were a matter of weeks away from opening our exhibition called Tantra. The view immediately below the Tantra Enlightenment to the Revolution is one of our conservators working on the type of objects that you'll see in there. But basically we got a lot of the objects installed and we prepared for an exhibition which was pre-COVID. So work is going on at the moment and has been to make sure that the social distancing is now in place for the exhibition so that people can safely travel through that exhibition. And we've got one or two more things to just finalise and put into that display. We're also bringing staff back to work on the Arctic Culture and Climate exhibition, which will open in the autumn, and there's more conservation that needs to be done there. The slide that you can see in the centre is a large sail, which is typical of the type of thing that might be on display. And the slide on your right hand side is one of the conservators using seal gut to mend a seal gut sail so it can then be mounted and put into the exhibition. Next slide, please. And here we have a view of one of the seal gut parkas, which is being conserved. And again, so we've got staff in now doing the conservation work. And next slide, please. We have other staff who are going in and making the mounts and the supports that will be used in the exhibitions and preparing and testing things and seeing how they look so that then we can get these exhibitions up and running in the next couple of months really. So lots and lots of work to do when we get back. Next slide, please. We also had a situation that the Arctic exhibition is replacing an exhibition called Troy, which some of you may have gone to, and if you did, thank you very much. Beautiful, beautiful exhibition where we had objects from all over the world coming in. We borrow objects to enhance our exhibitions, and we were just at the end of closing Troy and sending all our borrowed objects back to their original lenders when COVID and the shutdown and the lockdown hit. So one of the things we've been doing is over the past few weeks, as other countries release their restrictions earlier than the UK, where possible, we've been allowing, for example, people from Italy to ship their objects back to Italy and get them out of the museum. Next slide, please. And like the people who lent to Troy, we have collections all over the world, and all museums have been the same. Going to lockdown and suddenly you've got collections all over the world and you can't get them back. So museums have been incredibly kind to each other and as a community unbelievably helpful. We had some objects in Japan in one museum and we needed to store them until we could bring them back. And the Japanese museum that we were talking to said, we've got a problem with storage, we can't do anything. And the National Museum of Tokyo immediately rang us up and said, we'll have them, we'll look after them for you. And museums around the world are doing this for each other. And so part of reopening is bringing our collections back. We've had things in storage, we've had exhibitions that have finished in different parts of the world and also need to come back. So next slide, please. So we have an international loans and touring exhibitions programme, which is part of our income generation stream that go all over the world. And we have an exhibition called Email, which is the Mummies and Ancient Lives, which was in Montreal in Canada. I don't know if any listeners saw that exhibition when it reopened, but the exhibition in Montreal is closed and we are not able to send our staff out in order to deinstall it, which is a traditional way that we do that. So we've actually negotiated with the next venue that this collection is going to, which is in Toronto, and their staff have come down and deinstalled in Montreal with live links throughout at the museum. So the museum suddenly went on to Canada time with everybody working remotely and using their monitors to check what was happening, check the installation, talk people through what was happening and everything. And people have been fantastic at doing this kind of work. It's been really quite unprecedented, and it's something that we would never have thought we'd have to do. But again, all nationals are having to take this kind of approach. We're also trying to prepare for exhibitions because it's part of our income stream. We've signed contracts with museums all over the world. So at the moment, what we're doing is trying to honour those contracts. So we've got staff in to do work for exhibitions that are due out shortly. At the bottom left-hand screen is the American Dream. That's a series of paintings and watercolours and so on, and we've got objects that are being conserved and mounted as we speak almost, and they're being shipped out on the 18th of September. So again, work doesn't stop because we've got all these different things to do. For the UK exhibitions and UK loaning, it's slightly different because we are all in the same time zone and the same situation in COVID. So therefore, we're all doing similar things with museums, whereas the international scene is working on completely different timescales. So it's been quite a challenge. Next slide, please. Here's a view of some of the mummies that we're in the process of conserving for the next iteration of the mummies exhibition that will be going to Toronto shortly. And as you can see by the slide on the right hand side, we often use high levels of PPE, which everybody's familiar with the term PPE now, so I can just use it. This is an air-fed mask whilst somebody is actually reshaping one of the coffin cases, whereas on the left hand side we've got a conservator covering a very fragile bandaged coffin, bandaged mummy with a layer of net, and that net will just protect the whole of the bandaging whilst the objects are being moved, because obviously transporting, moving, lifting, putting into exhibitions, lifting out, putting them into a packing case and things is quite a lot of handling for objects. Next slide, please. In England we have something called the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and recently there was a big celebration of 1.5 million objects being found through the scheme. It's a scheme where metal detectorists are required to log their finds and say where they found them and so on. So although the metal detectorists hadn't been working during lockdown, they now can start metal detectoring again. And things are being found. What you can see on the screen is a coin hoard, which is actually in a ceramic vessel, which has been lifted out of the ground. And if you can see, the conservator is working through a microscope, and just behind it is an image, and you can just make out some coins in the top right hand side of it. So our role within the treasure process is to make sure that things like coins are identifiable, so that they can be identified and they can be valued. And the three little images on the right hand side are showing the process by the objects. The coins are heavily corroded, they're placed in a cleaning solution and then at the bottom of the picture you can see that you're able to make out the head and the writing on the coins. So next slide please. So we are returning to the museum and we're already doing things, but we can't do things quite in the same way as we did. On the left hand side of the slide you can see that there's a whole group of people where we carry out masterclasses, or people come to train us, and there's a lot of sharing of experience and training, and studentships and things go on in the museum, and we obviously can't work in this way anymore. There's just no social distance in there. The same as when we're laying out objects, we need to rethink how we social distance, so the whole process of how do we install our objects in an exhibition when two people need to handle it and it's quite a small object. So we've had to rethink the whole process and the way we work. But people are willing, people love the objects, and they find many different ways of finding the solutions. So thank you. Next slide please. So I'm going to stop there because I think I hope I've given you an idea of the type of things we've been doing, but I'm really happy to take questions. And I've got another screen at the side of me, so forgive me if I look like I'm just turning away from you. I just want to check the question and then I'll come back and tell you all what the questions are. Right, we've got Carol from Stallings, who's asking, is the Rosetta Stone still there or returned to Egypt? No, the Rosetta Stone's still in the museum. It's on the ground floor. It's available almost as soon as you go in, and we're doing some work at the moment to work out the path for the public when they come back into the museum, and the Rosetta Stone is absolutely key on the list, and you will go past it and you can still see it. So it's still there. So we've got Linda from Rowan. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce where Linda's from, but her question is, when the museum reopens, will it be free entry to visit? And is the reopening date set? So, yes, the reopening date is set, but I am sworn to secrecy at the moment. But by the end of the week, hopefully there'll be some press announcements about when we're opening. The museum is always free to the public. All its galleries are free to the public. The thing that you do have to pay for are the exhibitions, but there will be no exhibitions open when we immediately open. They will come later in the autumn. So you will have to book tickets because we've got to keep the social distancing right and make sure everybody who enters the museum is safe. So you may have to book a ticket, but you don't have to pay to come in. So, right. So Lee from Washington is asking, are visitors still allowed to touch the Rosetta Stone? No, I'm sorry. The Rosetta Stone's now in the showcase and you're not allowed to touch it. The problem with touching, and it might be really frustrating for people, because I know even from children we use our hands as part of our feeling process and understanding process, but our hands contain acid, our fingertips contain acids, and those acids can be really damaging to the collections. If you've got metal, for example, and you have I think if you have a silver medal and you place your fingers on the medal, sometimes it's possible for those fingerprints to actually etch into the metal over time, and then if as a conservator I wanted to try and remove that fingerprint, I would actually be taking away the surface of the metal. So for metals, that's why we don't touch. And then our hands also contain grease, and that grease can attract dirt, and the dirt then makes the objects not recognizable in the original form that they were. So as we become more aware of how we look after our collections, then we've taken decisions to keep them safe and not allow people to touch. We do have handling collections that we make available, but the actual objects themselves, I'm afraid, we don't let people touch. Let me have a look. Have there been any problems? Right, Barbara from Florida is saying, have there been any problems with various governments wanting return of their antiquities? It's an ongoing discussion. There's always people who would like to think about their objects, what the origins were, whether they can they can be returned to countries. The British Museum is quite unusual in that it was founded, and there's something called the British Museum Act, which doesn't allow us to deacquisition our collections, i.e. we can't decide they're not our collections anymore and give them back. And this can be a problem, and some of the ways we get around it, for certain countries we will offer something on long-term loan, which means that the objects can be with them, but they still technically belong to the museum. The decisions on things like this are really complex. It's not my area of expertise, I'm afraid, so I can't go in it too much. But from a collections care perspective, sometimes we have to be really careful. You know, our collections need looking after, and it can be quite a complex decision about even lending objects, let alone other bigger decisions about returning them or asking for them back. There can be things like resource communities, the First Nation people. If somebody wanted an object back and they're 4 generations away from the person it originally was, if you can imagine a family tree that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more people, then there's all these questions about, well, who actually owns that object now and things like that. So, as I say, very complex and beyond my kind of training to know all the details, and every object's got to be considered in its own merit. Now then, right, what I've got Gary from Hendersonville asking, what are the most recent acquisitions in the museum and how are they required? We acquire in a number of different ways. We can have gifts from people. People will bequest objects for us. We will go to auction houses where we want to pick up certain types of things where we've got gaps in our collection. And an example recently that was in the news was, if any of you know Hokusai, that beautiful Japanese artist that did the big giant wave that you see on so many adverts and things like that. So Hokusai was a beautiful printmaker, and recently at auction an album of his prints came up, and that came up within the last 9 months, and we were lucky enough to get it. So, but as I say, there can be things coming up all the time, and we collect in current as well as past historical things, and this is where the question about, do we collect a question of COVID masks as part of a memory and a recognition of this part of our history which has been so massive. I've got Gail from Seattle saying, I'm curious about the crystal skull and how it fared. So the crystal skull is basically a skull. I'm sorry, I sound so obvious, but it's made from crystal. It's made from rock crystal, and it's beautiful and it's pure, and it is the most marvelous object. Inorganic material is often much more stable than organic material. I think I've sort of demonstrated that naturally organic material decays and wants to decay, and what we're trying to do in museums all the time is slow it down. So if you think about the oldest object in the collection, it was made of stone. So anything that's made of minerals is probably really, really stable. There's obviously some minerals that will react in different ways, in which case, not being funny, if they're going to react, they've probably disappeared already. So most of the things that we have that are quite old in our collections are probably really quite stable, provided they've been kept in the right conditions. So the crystal skull's fine. Tell us about, oh, this is a complete wild one, sorry about this. Tell us about your necklace. This is Joyce from Denver. Is it from the museum? No, this is a necklace, forgive me, this is not helpful, but this is a necklace that was 3D printed. And it's printed in America by a company called Nervous System. So all the Americans out there, it's a company that was just outside Boston. I don't know if it's moved, and it's 3D printed by 2 professors from MIT, one of whom's a biologist, and it's something to do with the coral formations, and they use this as part of the algorithms for which to do the printing. I'll go back to the museum now. Right, no one in the photographs wears a mask. For any work during the pandemic, wouldn't it be important? This is from Roberta in Oregon. So, Roberta, thank you. A lot of the slides that I've used are pre-COVID. We've only just started going back into the museum. So, the government advice at the moment is for the museum, people visiting the museum to wear masks. We're also advising staff to wear face coverings, and our visitor services people will be advised similarly. So I guess different governments are asking different things of people. So masks will be worn, and they are worn wherever it's needed for normal PPE. So if we're working with chemicals, we would wear a mask. Some of our objects have got insecticides and pesticides that came with them from the past. So, for example, we've got some beautiful feather cloaks, and they're in absolutely perfect condition. And the moment we see a beautiful feather cloak in perfect condition, that probably means that it's got an insecticide on it from when it was originally collected. And those original insecticides included things like arsenic and mercury. So our staff immediately, when we are dealing with certain kinds of collections, full mask and filtered masks and things like that. So we have all sorts of reasons why we wear masks anyway. But I think when we all start going back to work more, there will be face coverings, and where necessary, there'll be COVID level face coverings as well that we'll be using. So thank you for letting me respond to that. Okay. Right, a question. I will be in the from Linda in Virginia. I will be in the UK in summer 2021. Will I still be able to visit the museum? Fingers crossed, unless there's another outbreak, of COVID, we will be open and we will be welcoming visitors as much as we possibly can. We really miss you all. Our normal visitor ratio, I think it's about 80% people from other parts of the world. And when we do open, it will be almost to the UK, because people aren't really travelling to England yet. So we will be delighted that you can get across and you can come to the museum and you can see all these different things. Let me see what else. So, how many days? Oh, so we've got Jean from St. Louis who's asking, how many days should you plan to see most of the exhibits at the museum? Oh, I'd say weeks, actually. I mean, we've got how many have we got? About 125 galleries. It's huge. It's a really, really big museum, and then we've got the exhibitions as well. I think what you've got to do with something so colossal, like for example the Met and other museums, you almost need to decide which bits you want to see, because it's so overwhelming otherwise. There's that you can go through so many different cultures and periods in history without getting overdrive with it all. I'd suggest that you did a little bit of work and decided which bits you wanted to see. There are various tours that go through the museum where you can see like the highlights and some of the best pieces, which might be better than trying to see it all, because it would take you days and days and days. And then there's the exhibitions on as well, so more to see as well. Let me have a look. Right, I've got Greg from Asheville asking, is there a danger to your objects from flash photography? Nice question. This is a really nice question, because yes, light will damage objects. Now, some museums will say no flash photography, and there can be a number of reasons for that. It might be because the museum thinks that level of flashlight is so intense that it might cause damage. Sometimes we can't have photography in museums because we've borrowed objects, particularly from private lenders, and they don't want them to be photographed. So the flash, no flash photography, no photography can have many different complex reasons. We don't say no flash, because I think it's really difficult to impose that, particularly when everybody's got a phone and they can, if a flash goes off in the phone, it's just too late and things like that. From a conservation point of view as well, the amount of time that that flash takes is low, and when you compare that for the total daylight that the object's in when the museum's open, and then the lights are on in the showcases and everything, that momentary flash it doesn't really add much to the overall light levels compared to what we do in opening the museum every day. So we don't, but you might find, again, if you've got museums with very light sensitive materials, say it's a gallery, a picture gallery with watercolours in it, they might just decide that those watercolours are just too sensitive to allow that. So every museum has got a different policy, but we try and let people take flash if they can. What we don't let them do is what we don't let people do is have tripods, and definitely not at the moment, because tripods obstruct visitor movement, and at the moment, coming back when we reopen, we've got to keep visitor flow as open as it possibly can be to keep people safe. Let me have a look. Right, I've got Joan from Glenview. What is the most important thing you've learned from the experience of having to shut down for this period of time? I think there's a lot of things we've learned. I think we've learned that working as a team is incredibly important, because when the museum was in scenario 4, they would not allow people to go into that museum apart from people who were keeping really critical services, as I say, like the fire, like the flood, like security, all keeping the object safe in that way. So we were reliant on those people to help us, and it really shows that people who work in museums care deeply, and they would take instruction from us, and they would do the work of my team on behalf of us in order to keep the object safe. What it also taught me is now we have technologies where we don't sit in the dark not knowing what on earth's happening to our collections. You know, our security team were our ears and eyes. We would ask them to walk around and tell us if we saw any moths flying in the galleries. We would, you know, they would be the ones who would wrap the showcases up and everything. So, and then we have the monitors, so we were able to think carefully about what was happening. There was always the fear. The biggest fear, I think, was always what happens if there's an incident, a major incident, say there was a terrorist incident. Then the interesting thing was we got a government agreement that should there be a major incident at the museum, where our staff were furloughed, and the English approach was they're furloughed and they must be given notice to come off furlough, and this was part of the government agreement. In the case of museums, he said, in the case of an incident, it goes by the wayside. Everybody can come in as they need to. You call them in and you get them in for the collections. So I guess we've learned to trust people. We've learned to trust our own instincts, that we do know that these collections are safe. And we've learned other things along the way. Like, for example, I've only been back at the museum for just over 18 months, so I didn't know we got something called a radium cabinet. And this is for our clocks and watches, you know, with the phosphorescent, the slightly glowing dials and things like that. So there's a special cabinet that is like a radiation cabinet. And what I didn't know was that every month you've got to go to that cabinet and check that it's working, open the door, look in and do something with the equipment inside, close the door and walk away again. And it was like, okay, I didn't know that. So I've been learning so much about the museum along the way. So we've learnt loads, and it's been great, and it's been such a community that's been helping us. It's been fantastic. So again, will masks be required on entry? Yes, masks when the public go back. Government advice changed on Friday, and the advice is that visitors should wear masks in museums. There was a hesitation about it, and now it's definite that museums are the same as shops and the same as public transport. Masks all the way through. Right. So Mark Webber from Boston is saying, how do you treat mould that might grow on items such as paper and wood? Mold will only grow when the humidity gets above 70%. So our first approach is prevention, that we keep our collections, again, when I showed you that graph, the relative humidity, we're keeping everything below 70 wherever possible. If something had got mold, and I know there's been incidents in museums or libraries where there's been, say, a fire, and afterwards they put the fire out with water, and then you've got a series of mouldy books and things like that. The ideal is to dry them as quickly as possible before mould starts to grow. And then if you do get mould, we certainly use places, we have access to, we haven't used it yet, thank goodness, a specialist company that deals with archivally damaged paper and so on, and they will take objects away and treat them. It's partly a drying process, and you've got to be really careful with moulds as well, because they can be a problem health and safety wise. So you've got to know what you're doing, you've got to be able to identify them and so on. So we would dry as quickly as possible. If it came to it, there were mould spores there, we would have people in full PPE, air-fed masks and things like that, probably dealing with dusting the mould off once it had dried, and then we would make really sure that the humidity that those objects have been in, were in future, sorry, was kept well below that 70% mark, because potentially there'd still be mould spores there. So it can be a challenge if you've got mass treatments to do where there's been, say, a flood or a fire. I'm aware of the time, and it's 8 o'clock. Let me see whether there is. Well, first of all, I'll answer 2 more questions. One's a question and one's a comment, and it's a lovely comment, so I'll finish with that. But first of all, Art from Tucson, Arizona is saying, is there CCTV throughout the museum that can be monitored? There is CCTV throughout the museum, and it can be monitored. It tends to be something that's used for security more than watching the objects, because it's not at the fine detail of looking at the surface of an object where things might be happening. So yes, CCTV is, I think most museums use CCTV within and outside the property to keep the object secure. So I'm just going to finish on a really lovely comment, and I'd like to thank Barbara from Lady Lake, who said, thank you for sharing your knowledge about the BM. I love visiting it when I was in England. I'm so glad you enjoy the museum. For those of you who haven't visited it, I really would recommend it. It is beautiful, and there's something for everybody in that museum, as there is in so many museums. You can go in there for peace, you could go in there to learn, you could go in there to be inspired. Use museums in any way that works for you to give you something more, whether it's a greater understanding of the people and the nations that people come from, or whether it's to make you a better artist or craftswoman or craftsman, sorry. So I'm going to close here, but I'd like to thank you all so much for being with me, and thank you for all the questions that you've asked, and I'm sorry I've not been able to get to all of them. You'll be hearing from a colleague of mine, Jill Cook, who's the keeper of Britain, Europe and Prehistory. I think she's your lecturer next week. Jill's lovely. She will share her immense knowledge with you. She has so much knowledge. I could listen to her for hours, and she'll be a delight. So I wish you all well, and I do look forward to you coming to the museum and joining us soon. Bye bye.